Hey, what's up, Taylor?
Hey, how's it going?
Good, how are you?
Good, good.
I guess if this is like the thing that starts the recording, um, I'll just give like a brief introduction to what the thing is. In like 2020, I wrote this document as a part of like a kind of like miniature thesis thing I did while at Northwestern University. It was essentially about what people mean when they call something blank core online. Supposedly, that's supposedly what it was about. Although I feel that it had ulterior motivations. Like I was interested in talking about like the switchover between film to digital, the convergence between like filmmaking and videography. That was like an early motivating factor to writing it in like when it first kind of became a thing in 2019. And then I wrote it through the pandemic, and I think I finished it in like July or August of 2020. And then it received some like minor notice among just online milieus, like new models, and just Twitter among like Zoomers that were just fascinated that someone would write 80 pages about this subject. Although when I look back at it now, I sort of just don't really know what to do much of it.
Yeah. But it was funny because I was actually thinking about new models when reading this. There's just like this thing that I think happens with new models where it's like they tend to focus on technical problems or like the problem of like the internet or like the distribution channels of the internet and like how can we disrupt these distribution channel. I don't know, I'm using a lot of square quotes here, but it tends to take on that kind of a character rather than what kind of symptom is the internet, or like what does the fact that engagement online necessarily takes this form, like what does that even mean that something like Instagram is even possible, or something like YouTube is even possible socially. That like that's something that I feel like isn't really taken up, at least by new models. And it's all about like, okay, well, how can we like subvert these platforms or create new platforms like this? The solution to the problem is seen as kind of like a technocratic one.
The doc kind of takes into account the same assumption that milieus like new models or some other stuff does, that when the internet happened, it like qualitatively changed like everything. And I think in the past few years, a big thing that's changed for me is I just don't really think that's true anymore. I don't know if I fully bought into that when I was writing it, but I at least like thought the internet had more of a dynamic presence, where today I just think really it was just sort of like a quantitative increase in just sort of like the amount of just like information people receive. But I actually don't think it represented some kind of qualitative change. But I think that sort of grants a piece of technology a kind of agency that it in fact doesn't actually have. And it's really a matter of just like people's subjectivity, which of course is coming into contact with that technology, but is itself like constituting it. And the question is, why is it that the technology actually seems like something that's like totally alienated from them and like works on them rather than they being a thing that work on it?
Yeah, totally. I mean, like the stupid way of putting it might be like, what would like Athenians, like ancient Athenians, have done with the internet? Like if the internet had existed in ancient Athens, like would they have still had Instagram?
Yeah, like all of this stuff represents some kind of need on the part of people, even though they act like it's something that dominates them. It's like, would people like 400 years ago have felt a need if they had the internet to make something like Instagram?
Exactly.
I think the assertion people would like to make is like, no, the internet makes people like this. And it's like, I think people were already like that before the internet in like the 80s or like 90s or something. I don't think they were like that like 400 years ago. But I think in the late 20th century, the type of person that wanted the internet already existed.
Yeah, I mean, certainly. I mean, the thing that people will like most often cite as like an example of the way that the internet has just totally changed social interactions would just be like the emergence of new. I mean, I guess maybe this is what your document would be about. I don't know that people would necessarily call them cores, but would just be like people finding weird sort of fetish communities or finding like, that there might have been like a few furries spread throughout the United States for the past 100 years or something like that. Like people who got really into seeing a Bambi or something like that, and then like made their own like DIY Bambi suit, and like kind of got off on playing around with it. But then like the internet kind of makes it into this phenomenon where these people can find each other, and because these people can find each other, that community grows and it blossoms. But like the fact that someone was already sort of interested in becoming Bambi is like a phenomenon regardless of the internet.
It's like a social phenomenon. It's not like people are being manipulated by like mass media or something like that.
Right. Well, I mean, yeah, I guess these things do sort of influence. There is like a mutual influencing.
Oh yeah. I'm maybe over exaggerating the other direction.
Yeah. So I guess my question, like broad question on cores, and I think that one of the ways you put it is like, how can we like, actually had never heard this term before. I guess maybe it's a Twitter thing, and I like, but this concept of in before, right? That you're sort of critiquing the critique of your own argument before someone else can. So you like present a tweet, I'm guessing, and then you're already like refuting the rebuttal of the tweet before the rebuttal has even come in.
Oh, it's like an old 4chan thing of just being like, before you guys like start complaining in the comments, I've already thought of it. What about that in particular?
Well, I think that you had used it like, how can we like in before social movements, or like how can we in before new cores or something like that, so that you can sort of predict the emergence of a new core, or predict the emergence of a new like aesthetic social movement, or not even an aesthetic social movement, just like a social trend in general. And I guess the question would be like, why would you even want to do that?
That's a good question, because I think one thing that like baffled people when they like read this is they think it's going to be about describing why people use that as a descriptor online. And that's actually the thing that just never does. I don't think the doc ever actually really bothers with it.
Well, I think it does. Well, it talks about, you talk about the origin of hardcore.
Yeah. But now it's just sort of something that I guess if I were to try to like give a sort of account of it, there's something appealing about the ability to identify the ways like something looks. I was like talking about this with Thomas Laprade. Is that how you say his last name?
Laprade, yeah.
Laprade, okay. Yeah. I Latinized him. But anyway, there's people in like the comments of like some social media post of some picture, and they'll be asking like what kind of aesthetic this is. I don't know. I can identify it at the level of like my interest in like music. I would like hear something when I was like 18 or 19, and I would be like, oh, I want to find more things that sound like this. So I like rate your music and stuff. And I would like click on genre lists and just like go through. And then I would have the experience of just like trying to accumulate in like playlists or like YouTube playlists or whatever, like all of these songs that supposedly like sounded the same as like this thing I had this first encounter with. And then after a while, I'd be like, I'm not really getting anything from like doing this. I'm not having the same experience. And I would have this moment where I'm like, well, I guess the experience of that music, like there is like something specifically that first encounter with it that I was like, whoa. But it's also about like my encounter with it, and just like the mere reproduction of how a thing sounds isn't really doing the same thing. But on the thing you said of like, what would be the motivation of like trying to like detect something before it happens in that way? I feel like part of the document was motivated by, I guess there's like a sort of like perennial artist concern about like my aesthetics are being hijacked or something like that. But I was following like graphic design blogs when I was like in college. And I feel like that was like a large concern of people, of like, you spend all this time making some like look, and then suddenly it's like being used by some like random company who didn't hire you. So it's sort of like defense of your own racket. And there was like a lot of speculation I remember I read Toby Shorin's like this article he wrote in 2017 or 18 about like the marginal utility of aesthetics, and it's just basically about this. And it's sort of about like building quote unquote like defense mechanisms inside of like the look of something to make it hard to appropriate, like maximalist type aesthetics that are difficult to get like an intern to like reproduce if you wanted to.
It's like putting like counterfeit proof measures into the printing of dollar bills. Yeah, it's like the aesthetic version of that. Yeah.
But it's like, I've seen Catch Me If You Can. So I know that people will work around that, and you will always find someone that can do it just like you. Yeah. So I feel like it's sort of, in retrospect, I feel like it's kind of the wrong argument to be having. And I think I even detected that then, because I think there is like a conceit to the document. Whatever people do, they're going to figure out how to like do whatever you're doing. But I think at another level, it's already like working with a sort of like degraded notion of like aesthetics. It's about like the look of something, like the immediate like look of something, and not like the encounter between the person experiencing it and the object, which is why I brought up the music thing earlier, that it's not just about the specific object, although it may be endowed with like something just like incredible about it. It's also like about the encounter between like the viewer and the object, which is why I think there is a different kind of relationship. Like that's actually the thing that really needs to be dealt with.
At the beginning of the text, you talk about who the text is for. And you say that this is like not an academic paper, but this is for people kind of working within these forms that you're talking about, people who are either filmmakers or artists, or even maybe content creators, or some of these other sort of more degraded forms that you end up talking about. And so
I don't know if it's degraded. Maybe I would have then, but I don't know if I'd say it anymore.
Yeah. Well, maybe let's talk about that too, but I'll continue with this line of questioning. Just, who is it for? And like, who do you imagine these people to be? And then I think that for me goes towards answering this question of why would someone want to be early in identifying a core, or like early in identifying some kind of aesthetic shift within the culture? Is it just so that you might be able to like capitalize upon that for like your job or for market reasons? Or I think that there's one sort of revealing moment in the document where you said that this might be more than I'd care to admit about just being cool, right? Is it like just like you should be able to spot these things so that you can be wearing the right clothes and listening to the right music so that you appear cool to your peers or to a certain set of people?
Maybe, yeah. I think by the end, I was like really up and down on like how I was viewing like what exactly the ends of what I was doing was. I think if I want to be like more serious about it, it's probably about people that like work in like the greater like industry of like culture. They have to stay in the know. And I remember I had this like talk with my friend and the professor who advised this paper, Callum Walter, who now teaches at Cal Arts. He's like a filmmaker. I'm trying to like recall this conversation fully, but I think it was like 2017 or 18. And one of my friends was talking about the 90s and like movies in the 90s and how people have nostalgia for the 90s or something like that. And he's my professor who ended up advising this paper, and his way of thinking about stuff like this had a really big influence in the paper. He was like, well, you can't really be thinking about that. You have to be thinking about like what's actually going to be coming next. So you can like really, if you really want to be serious about it, how you want to like hop on the next trend before it happens. So you actually need to be thinking about how people are already susceptible to having nostalgia for like the 2000s or even the 2010s, like right now in the middle of it, and how you're going to like capitalize on that. It is about like capturing markets before they've like quite opened. It's really about like making money, and you could use the course doc as something for like consulting if you wanted, for like advertisement executives or like people who work in like film or video or like advertisement photography or something like that. And that's something that's just been in play for like a long time about how to just like capture general nostalgia or something like that. I mean, something the surrealists were inspired by was like this one book that was like published in Britain in like the 1910s or something like that about like, I don't remember the title of it, but it's like called like The World of the Past. And it's about like how interiors looked in the 1880s or something like that. And that was like something that was like of interest to them. And they're interested in like turning on its head. That's not advertisement, but it was something that was already in play. And I guess it's also gets at what's sort of like missed out on, in that like there used to be this kind of relationship between this sort of like vanguard art and the sort of kitsch that would basically be looking at that to sort of like redeploy it as like pre-digested experience. But now that doesn't really exist anymore. So now it sort of like relies on a sort of like psychotic consultants to actually tell advertisement executives like what's what, instead of them just having this pool of material that they can pull from for the next advertisement.
Mm-hmm. Well, because the avant-garde is just irrelevant, you mean?
It's not irrelevant. It's just sort of like something that's dissipated because like the world is like lost a sort of like world historic quality. And I don't know, I feel like art and like avant-garde art requires a kind of like utopian impulse, at least optimism, that I just think is not really present today. And there is like art that I'll like look around and be like, it's good. But it doesn't like sort of capture a kind of social imagination that art of like something like the 1910s might have, because there was not this idea that the world as it existed is going to be overcome. And I think art was always like bound up with that question, that there was like that art represented a sort of like transformative quality of the world. And now if the possibility to like completely overcome the world as it is doesn't exist, the question of art too is like thrown up in the air. And people phrase it at the level of like, well, art's jumped all these sharks and what's it going to do next? We have to just like return to the past and blah, 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 blah. But it's like, I think it only appears that way because it's sort of like art's moment is like kind of like past. So now we kind of view all these like random high points and just be like, oh, we've like done everything. And maybe like the fact that people kind of like keep repeating these moments actually poses that it's like, they're all sort of like incomplete. And it's not like art can go and like resolve all those problems for it.
You know, relating it back, I guess, to the marketers or the kitsch culture sort of attempting to crib off of the avant-garde, or the avant-garde sort of constantly liquefying into kitsch culture and it needing to sort of manically try to escape that liquefaction or whatever. And because that doesn't exist today, I guess like the only way that these marketers, or even like the avant-garde as like maybe tailing the marketers, attempts to be progressive is by being the first one to nostalgize, if that's a word. What's the word? What would be the right word? But to turn the most like recently past period into nostalgia. So that's why you're seeing sort of like this nostalgia cycle just accelerates. We're like, it feels like we're closing in on this like spiral of like even trying to discern what is a nostalgia for a certain period will get incredibly hazy, where it's like there will be like a nostalgia for the 2024 appropriation of 2004 aesthetics or something like that, right? Where it just like, there's kind of a total collapse where everything just becomes this, whatever, like late capitalist mush of the like, that history sort of gets flattened or becomes opaque, and it loses all of its sort of like original vitality. Like, I think, you know, like
texture to it.
Yeah, there is a certain texture to it. I mean, maybe in the way, I think, I think I had read something else of yours that I thought might have been in this course document, but I think it was your review of Skinamarink.
Oh yeah.
And you were talking about sort of like the layers of sort of, there's like digital compression with, sort of like fake film grain noise added on top of it. And then like there's sort of like this weird blend.
I like figured it out. They use like a really shitty fake film grain filter, but then they pass it through at particular moments, like when it falls into shadow, like phase warping. So it like swirls in ways that like film grain or like even like a filter doesn't do. So it kind of like is like when you just like rub your eyes and then like open them up. So it's like a whole different thing. I thought that was really great because it sort of is like, it takes something that people think they have like a grip on of like, this is how film looks. This is like something that's like cinematic. And then it actually uses it as like it actually uses it aesthetically instead of taking it as like a presumption. It's something that's like becomes like an element of why the film is like scary rather than it just being yet another just like sort of like rule of thumb that people have when they're like making something. Mm-hmm. You do this because it looks good or something.
Right. Yeah. So maybe that's a way to get into to the section of the doc that I actually found most interesting. I think in the little preface you said that it's the driest and longest. But it is.
Oh yes, that's the only part I find interesting. Also, now it's just the film video, just like shop talk.
Exactly. This like discussion between film and video, and I had a few questions about the way that you frame things or pose things in there. And one that kind of struck me is I think that you had categorized film as a medium, but digital photography as a tool. I don't know if that's exactly the right phrasing.
It's not that I think that's just like true. I think when I wrote that, I thought that at a level, that's just how people like thought of it. Where it's just like, if you still use like film today, it's like artful, but like video is like a tool, or at least that was like something that it's also been like sort of flattened over today, but at least in like the 80s when there was like professional videographers and professional like cinematographers, they were like, these are the people that do a job. And like, these are the people that like do like quote unquote art, but also that was already something that was played on in like the 70s and 80s by early video artists. But then that itself got like flattened out when there was like this convergence between like filmmaking and videography. And then now I feel like there's just general confusion about like, why do people do videography at all? In the same way that someone else might be like, why shoot on film at all? There's also like, why make video art at all? That doesn't make sense to me, because like we have this like cinema thing that is shooting on the same cameras. Why is this like a rarefied sphere?
Well, I guess can you define video the way you're using it there?
I guess just like supposedly initially it was just supposed to be more like consumer technology or stuff that was made for like shorter form or just like quick turnaround production. And already that was laden in like film as like a thing, because 8mm was already supposed to be that. And so is 16mm too. Like 16mm Bolex cameras were invented so soldiers in like World War II could like use them and film the battlefield and like have this quick turnaround. So already that was something that people wanted to do from the beginning. And I think people wanted to do that.
35mm still photography is similar.
Yeah. Even before that, like with Ziga Vertov's movie, Man at the Movie Camera, it already poses that it would be nice if everyone got a camera and got to record their own life. So it's like something that's already laden in film. So from the beginning, it's mushy, but then it sort of splits off into two spheres by virtue of it being two different workforces. Like there are these like between the 70s and the early 2000s, there's these people who, and still today to an extent, but it has sort of disintegrated because there's like now cross contamination between these workforces. There's people that work in like video, and then there's people that work in like film. And the film is a sort of like more rarefied sphere that has these like unionized professionals, and videography is like supposedly like, I got to get this like job done like pretty fast. I need these like people that can just come in with like cameras or whatever and just like record. And I might use this for any like particular purpose, but there's some that's just like not suitable for. But even on television, people are using
isn't
video.
Really art.
Yeah, but also it's sort of posed, that was already something that was kind of posed in like film. I do think it's kind of like a mushy thing, like in the doc itself.
Yeah, I mean, I think photography and including sort of motion picture photography in that is fraught because it's like an indexical medium too. It's like it's the thing that's on your driver's license that like proves who you are. So, and it has just all these industrial applications. So it is that weird thing where it's like it appears as art, but if you start to sort of interrogate like why it's art, it becomes tricky. I think that you use an example. I mean, this is more sort of a medium specific example, but you use like the Pedro Costa films as an example in the piece, where there's like his first one, Osos, I think it's called, is shot on film, and then the next two are shot on video. And like that one, so I watched these, or I watched two of them sort of before this. And the first one, I mean, it's like incredibly shot. It looks beautiful. I think it won the like best cinematography at Venice or something like that. I mean, and it has this kind of like magic because of that. It feels like art. It feels like a movie. It feels like it feels like sensuous and sumptuous, and the colors are beautiful, and it's really rich, and the characters are beautiful, like the actors are beautiful, and it just all like, and it sort of romanticizes this situation that they're in, where it's like, oh, this actually doesn't seem, it's like, I kind of want to like hang out there because it's so beautiful there, right? And then in the next one, it's shot on mini DV, and like the blacks are really crunched, and like their faces are all red, and they're sort of just like sitting there on the bed like doing heroin, and it looks like a nightmare, right? And then they're like cleaning up this like pigsty of an apartment, and the choice, right, to shoot on film or to shoot on digital video like changes the tone and like reception of the film completely. It's like it becomes sort of grotesque and hard to watch on mini DV, and sort of like makes you actually empathize with the characters more in a certain way, because you're witnessing the total degradation of their condition, like these totally degrading conditions. And the actual format that it's captured in like emphasizes that in a way that like the film sort of like romanticizes it and like beautifies it.
Maybe I don't know. I feel like I have kind of mixed feelings about this now, because I guess the supposed reason Pedro Costa like decided to switch to like consumer video cameras was he wanted to kind of get closer to subjects that he sort of felt like a moral prohibition on, or whatever, on like shooting on film, traditional cinematography. And I don't really know how to feel about that anymore. There is that maybe when you use like consumer video or something, it gives it, or at least gave it, I don't know if it kind of does this anymore, a sort of like gritty realism to it. Or it kind of has this documentary style that people associate with it. I don't know. I feel as though actually what it ended up doing, at least for me, is I can like look at a frame of like one of the mini DV films, or as later like HD videography films. I feel like I can look at them and be like, this is very beautiful. Like, I think, I'm not sure if I feel like I'm just in total alignment with the ethos. It's like, do not aestheticize like destitution or something, because it's like, I think ultimately people are going to find ways to do that anyway. And if anything, I think you can, like, I think there is something about mini DV that like, it does create this kind of tension where it has this sort of like documentary style, and you're like, this is horrible. But then you're forced to look at it for so long that you start to actually be like, there is something really beautiful about like the sort of like crunchiness of this like image. Like it actually does like evoke to some kind of like Caravaggio, like chiaroscuro type deal, with like how crushed blacks get and how bloomed out highlights get, and the way that color seems to like shimmer around with like the noise, when you're forced to just like look at the image for that long. And you're like watching this like terrible poverty and like these terrible things happen to people. And you're like, no, this is like a beautiful film. And that, you know, there is this whole debate in film about that. Like there is that, that last Serge Jani like essay, Tracking Shot in Capo, which is like about that. It's him reading a review, I think by Antonini, I think, but I could be wrong, about the movie Capo, which is done by the guy who did Battle of Algiers. And it's a Holocaust movie. And there's a shot in it where the camera tracks over a woman like runs at a fence to like jump, like try to jump a fence at a concentration camp. She's gunned down, and then her body falls into this like wire fence, and her hand catches in one of the wires. And then there's this tracking shot over to her hand that it gives a close up on it. And I think in the original Antonini review, it's like, this is clearly a terrible filmmaker who made this, because no one would, like, someone in their right mind would never have made that fucking tracking shot. But as like a filmmaker, you like hear that and you're like, surely that's like true, because I'm like, that does seem like a demented decision to make at the level of like filming. So there, I feel like at the beginning there is this sort of like tension in like film between like aesthetics and like morality. But I feel like a lot of people do give morality like sort of like the a priori thing in like film, and it's like, it can't really be that to me. Like I have heard people say things like that I've worked in film on, and being like, the number one thing we need to consider as filmmakers is ethics. And I'm like, well, that can't possibly be true, because if it is, we're just simply not making a good film. Right. But I feel like there was this initial tension between the sort of like, because of when film emerged from this post 1848 moment, and then film really comes into being before, like a little bit before, and then after World War II, where these like the world jumped the shark on like these like terrible like atrocities, and then suddenly it becomes this thing that's like totally imbued in film. And maybe actually people don't really come into contact with that anymore, because it just really takes a generation for people to kind of forget these tragedies, because people have this amazing ability to actually forget. The great feat of the coming generation will be their ability to forget 9/11. And that will be really fantastic, actually, or else people would not be able to live.
Yeah, but these atrocities are kind of like the perennial subjects of film, you know, especially at like the prestige Hollywood Oscar level. It's like there's going to be a World War II film or a World War I film like every year.
There's only tension between it, because that's exactly what people want. Like people want to see atrocities in like a film. They want it. Like I was watching the new Dune movie, and it's sort of whatever, but there's like this whole thing in the movie where the first half of it, he's like, oh, if I go and like I do all this stuff and become a leader, billions of people in the galaxy are going to die. And then the second half, he like drinks some like elixir thing, and then we stop caring about that. But that's when the movie gets awesome. And there's even a point where he just like, we got to go get our nukes. And then they get them immediately, and then they like fire them at like the capital of the planet they're on. And then you watch it and you're like, well, this is awesome. Clearly, as much as people wrung their hands in the previous century about nuclear bombs, everyone of course wishes they had their own private stash and could like blow up a city with it.
Well, it's funny that I was talking to someone about Oppenheimer recently. I mean, that's the film about the bomb. And I mean, I actually kind of liked it, but the thing that I thought was most disappointing about it is the actual explosion of the bomb.
Oh yeah, it's not awesome at all.
The explosion of the bomb is really lame. It's like the whole movie is building up to the explosion of the bomb, and it looks really lame.
And it's also not doing some like previous century, like we refuse to show the bomb. type of deal. It actually does.
It shows the explosion, but it's just a wimpy explosion, right? Yeah, like that would have been one way to treat it, is to just not show the explosion, but it does show the explosion, but it's just an incredibly underwhelming explosion.
Maybe people listen to this and be like, this is so shocking. But no, I feel like this is totally what cinema is about. It's like when you show an awesome explosion, it needs to be like awesome. And you're like, you watch and you're like, whoa.
I mean, and literally awesome, not just like awesome, but like you should be, you should be in awe. Yeah. It should be like horrific and awesome. And like in like this thing that's hard to even comprehend.
Yeah, like desire and fear or whatever. You're like, the bomb is very scary, but I want to drop the bomb.
You fear most what you desire.
How did we get on this conversation? Oh yeah, destitute poverty. And like, because it's like, it is the same type of deal. When you show like destitute poverty, people do aestheticize it. But of course, if you show this in the ugliest way possible, people are going to find a way to like look at this like aesthetically. It's just like true.
Yeah, that's actually, I was thinking about that as I was watching, I think In Vanda's Room is the second one. Yeah. About why this is also kind of, this is like, or like the perennial topic of the mainstream film is war and destruction, and the perennial topic of like the art house film is destitution and poverty and addiction.
Yeah. Yeah, that's definitely true.
I don't know. How do you feel about film? I mean, you shoot film photography, still photography.
Yeah, on photography, the thing I was like talking about in the doc was just like, you know, I do like film photography, but I feel like it like does force me to like make kind of like decisions. But then also in a different way, it will have me like looking at old photos in like a different type of way I'll like look at it and I'll be like, why did I take this photo? Like, what was I thinking? And then I'll like go back and I'll find like particular things in photos that I was like, there was actually something in this photo that I rejected at the time. And now I want to try to like recreate that again in the present. And I feel like if digital cameras and like digital shooting, it's really easy to like take a lot of pictures and then not really take responsibility for any of them because I took so many. I don't need to like, it's like, yeah, I guess I just like kept shooting and that photo happened, but you know, that just like happened.
Or it's just more of a chore to look through what you've shot too.
Yeah, it's like a pain and I don't like doing it. I do it professionally. I don't want to do it for myself. It kind of does come down to like that. And yeah, I guess it is sort of just like, there has to be at least some level of like fetishism in it, although maybe not, because I feel like half the time I'm like doing a lot to like undermine what makes film look like film in like a sort of like counterintuitive way. I don't really like green very much when I'm like shooting. I don't like films that look like really filmy. I like high ISO films. It looks like it'd be impossible to have shot a particular picture on film. And I like really low ISO films that just like are completely impeccable and like have no grain at all, that I could just as easily be doing all of this on like a digital camera. And yet I don't. But I'm just kind of used to working that way now. Yeah, I don't know. There is like certain things about like, I have like an understanding of the way that like color is rendered in like particular films that I like work with a lot. If like a digital camera, like the digital camera I own for work, I just don't like the way like particular colors get rendered as much. And I guess I could mess with that in like Lightroom, but I don't want to.
Yeah. No, I think I've thought about this a lot too with my own stuff. You know, I've shot lots of still pictures on film. And I mean, I think one of the bad habits I was doing for a while is shooting. Well, I picked up digital photography because I was just spending too much money on film.
Yeah.
And so then I started like grading my digital photos to look like they were shot on film. And then I was kind of like, well, what's the point of doing that? Like, that's when it started to like just really feel like a fetish. And then I'm like, well, what is this fetish all about? You know, like why do I think that the photos shot on film are more beautiful than the photos shot digitally? Like, is it the way that the colors are rendered? Is it something about the grain? Is it something more abstract about my like relationship to the mechanism, or is it like just the history of photography like looks a certain way, so the photos that I like were shot on film, and so I'm trying to emulate the photos that I like, and if I shoot them digitally, it's kind of hard to achieve that. I don't know. I still don't really know that I have a great answer for why I prefer the aesthetic of film photography to digital photography. Although I don't really feel that way with motion pictures. Like it doesn't really. And in fact, I prefer watching. Certain like what do you call them, cinephiles will like love to go see like a 35 millimeter print of something, right? And I'm gonna go see tomorrow night actually like a 4K restoration of Nostalgia, the Tarkovsky movie, and I hope it looks great, but I'd much rather see like a really pristine digital restoration of something than like an original print, because usually the original print just looks like shit. It has a certain character, but it's not like a pristine image.
Yeah, I guess it really depends, because sometimes I will really like a nice like restoration, but then a lot of times because of the way that like I feel like a lot of just like restoration houses will just like completely fuck up coloring, and they'll do something like really stupid just because of just some bad judgment on however they always like color something. I remember the one for like
I just recolored all of his movies and they look bad.
Yeah, and that was even of him supervising, and I saw those and I was like, these look terrible, I guess. And sometimes you do get like a really great print of like an old film, or a great like reprint of like one because someone had like an inner negative or something like that. But it really is like an up in the air. I don't really have like a super strong preference, because you can come across some like really beat prints and like stuff that gets played at like major theaters.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I saw like Blade Runner at this cinema in New York called Quad Cinema like a few years ago, and it's a 35 millimeter print. And it was like really beat up, and it kind of tarnished the experience for me, certainly.
Yeah, I remember I saw Hana B like a few years ago, and the soundtrack of the film got like really fucked up, and it like lost sync, and it just like had dead sound for like a large section. I was like, this is admittedly annoying.
Yeah.
Well, I guess that's maybe to bring her back around to something else that you had talked about in the doc, is like trying to make the audience aware of the medium, or to make them like aware that they're watching a film, or that the thing that they're experiencing is not just reality. It's a piece of art.
Yeah.
I don't even know if I was dealing with it at that level when I wrote it. I don't like, I feel like a problem with the doc is it doesn't really deal with like art as like a question. And it sort of like takes a lot of the presumptions of just like general discourse and doesn't really like question them, at least the presumptions of the time. And it was just like, oh yeah, draw attention to this as being like shot on film. I noticed a strange moment when I was like rereading it, where I was like talking about how like, not that this was like wrong or something, because this was like basically me describing my experience of like a film, but I was like talking about watching Stray Dogs by like Simon Long, and how after a while I just began to notice like the digital noise on like the image, and the way that a lot of the images were like super textured and detailed. And so it'd kind of be about the interplay of the noise and then the actual texture of like what was recorded, which I thought was like cool at the time. But I'm sort of like, I felt like what I was like really kind of recording there was like me talking about my own like eyes glazing over and then like literally looking at like the surface of like an image instead of like what's going on. Because I feel like there is other things to actually notice when you're like watching a movie like that besides just like the surface of an image. And that's sort of like indicative of like someone watching something who doesn't really know what to do with it. And maybe when people get like really caught up in when they're like, oh, the medium, like that happened in like the 60s and stuff, when people got like really caught up on like medium, even of something like painting and sculpture rather than painting and sculpture, it became about the medium of this particular type of paint or something like that. I think that is about people kind of like losing contact with like, okay, when we're making art, what is this supposed to be like about at all? And it's sort of like, well, we're shooting on film, so I guess it's like about like the fact that it's like on film, and like there did seem to be like greater opportunities of something like cinema that wasn't just about drawing attention to the fact you were in a cinema prior.
Yeah, I mean, this is actually something that I've spent a lot of time thinking about recently, not in regards to film. It's kind of strange that, I mean, although I kind of work in film, I don't really treat with great care questions of film itself as a medium. But like, I think about these in terms of like the history of art in painting and sculpture. And, you know, someone like, well, you know, this moment, like you were saying, in the 60s and 50s or whatever, it starts earlier. But, you know, someone like Barnett Newman, who's the guy that, you know, paints stripes, just like there's an interview with him and he's just sort of like point blank says that, you know, there was just this question that I had and that all of my peers had of like, well, what am I going to paint? You know? And so the painting itself kind of becomes the thing which you paint. And his strategy of the zips, as critics would call them, was just like, what's kind of like the minimal gesture that I can make that this will still be considered a painting or still be considered a work of art that like draws attention to its objectness, yet also still keeps it within the realm of art and allows it to be something that can be like allows the question of like, what is art to be raised. It's like this sort of like transcendent quality of art becomes posed in that moment where it's like, what's the minimal gesture that I can make for this to still qualify as art and not just as some like utilitarian or quotidian object? And then like, what does that say about this whole enterprise? You know, that was like sort of like art sort of unraveling.
Maybe, yeah. I feel like there's like a split too with this, because in a way that does all seem to like it's still trying to ask the question of like modernism. Like abstract expressionism was still interested in modernism, and like Clement Greenberg took it up as such. But then people can also like read like this sort of like split that happens and like the interest in like the material of paint or the action, because the other way that abstract expressionism gets phrased or gets framed is action painting, which is kind of how like postmodernism will take up abex, because it becomes about the act of painting rather than the object of the painting. And so it kind of has this like split legacy with like concern with the medium, because concern with the medium was like, as you said, it was like there for like the whole time, but then it kind of gets centered by particular art in the 60s.
Well, I mean, it starts with like impressionism, really.
Yeah, like what's the specificity of like painting? But then it kind of becomes like, what's the specificity of paint? But painting is sort of like a social thing, and then there's like paint the material. And I feel like that's like something that does happen like a little bit later. I don't know. Yeah, it's sort of like I guess it's difficult for me to like look at this and be like, what was my ass thinking? I was like getting embarrassed reading it last night.
No, I enjoyed it. It definitely like provoked good conversation at the very least, you know? Yeah, I don't know. It did get me thinking about medium though. Like, what is the medium of film? or what is the medium of digital photography? You know, you talk about like digital sensors or something like that. Is celluloid or whatever, you know, is that the medium of film? Or is like, you know, chemical photosensitive paper, photosensitive like strips, is that really what the medium is?
Well, I think the form is just like cinema. I think this is like kind of the problem is it just makes film the thing. But even Stan Brakhage, she was like working a film as a material, but he was still playing it for like people. And like, that's like the thing. And it's same for like digital cinema. Like, even though people are shooting on digital cameras, they're still playing it in like theaters, or they're watching it at home. There's still like a relationship between the people watching and the thing. And it's not like it's not like that's being really avoided in like the document, I guess, but there is this like kind of like labor ethic thing that's like happening in the doc that I think is like very popular among like some artists. That's kind of like, we want to bring people in contact with like the labor of this art. But again, it's sort of like, it's like about like preserving one's own like racket. Because if it's about drawing attention to like, oh, this is on film and someone had to do this, like, it's like, we better support our artists or something like that, where I'm kind of like, I don't really actually care. I don't think I care about that. And I don't think that's like the point of like someone, I don't think that's the point of someone like Brecht or someone like Benjamin taking up Brecht when it was about like bringing attention to the form. I think that was actually about like, you can do this too. You can be the person that's changing this form. Mm-hmm. And like, that's what's actually like, I feel like missing of like a lot of work is that it's about like turning consumers into producers. Not only can I change this form through a great work of art, but you can too. And actually it's coming in contact with like the form of the work of art that you can actually be tasked by it.
But what about content? Isn't content people taking up, the public taking over and taking up these forms?
It is, isn't it? Like, I mean, it's not like I want to give it like a positive appraisal of it. It's just sort of like, is it people taking up like a form, or like content does like, you know, there's like a sort of like form to like a YouTube video, like that people can like recognize, but it's also something that's like people immediately know what the form of like a YouTube video is from the second it starts or whatever. There's like no surprises buried in the form. And I think there's like a claim made where it's like, it kind of takes up what people already say of like, content doesn't have like a form, it's just like a stream of information, where it's like, clearly that's not true. Like, there is like a kind of like shape to how this like stuff works, and it like,
right, there are aesthetic decisions being made.
Yeah, it's just a question that people don't take them as aesthetic decisions. Like, that's really the problem, that like, if people were like in contact with the specific decisions being made when they're making a video, and they were like conscious of themselves being conscious of it, that'd be like one thing. But I don't think they are. They like, and maybe this is actually a kind of like benefit to the document, is like, the fact that someone can watch a YouTube video and then they can like see this sort of like tutorial that helped make it or something, like in through the watching, like all of this stuff has kind of been pre-digested to be content. It's just sort of about like the experience of it. Like, maybe actually there is like a moment for people to like look at a piece of like content and be like, oh, you know what? This does actually, there's like something about this that actually like does something. Like,
I mean, I think there's a lot of great content, actually.
Another problem with this is that it speaks about content as just like this thing, and not that there's like specific pieces of it, because there is, and you actually do have to treat all of this stuff at an individual by individual basis of like,
right. I mean, it's hard to do because, you know, the content is sort of so easily consumable and sort of easily consumable in just a gigantic feed, and you don't have a moment to sort of reflect on what you've just seen. Not to say that that doesn't happen. I think that one way it actually kind of happens is people kind of like curating content for each other, right? It's like we send each other pieces of content on Instagram that we feel like gets at something, or like it like, right, has something to it that's worth sending and worth considering. And, you know, whether that's like aesthetic or an idea or whatever, there's like tons of it actually. And doing something like curating a bunch of TikToks into a museum show, I think sounds kind of lame. I don't know. Maybe this kind of like aesthetic reflection on these objects is already happening in ways that's too easily dismissed.
Maybe, yeah. I guess the question is also about like content's like affirmative character, whether or not it's just like affirmative. Can there be like a moment of like imagination in like a particular video or not? It is just sort of like, can people kind of come into contact with their own imagination through it rather than just having like their imagination foreclosed?
Yeah. And I used to kind of lament the fact that, art doesn't seem to be doing anything new. Like the avant-garde seems to be totally impotent, and was like really yearning for a new form of avant-garde, or for like the reconstitution of an avant-garde that actually felt like it was producing something vital. But I don't know. I think it took me a while to realize that that's also just that kitsch and avant-garde are both symptoms of the crisis of bourgeois art, right? And that you shouldn't just kind of, maybe it's become one-sided in that everything is kitsch, but I don't know that I still even really believe in like the necessity of the avant-garde or something like that.
Yes, necessity would have to be like proven true in practice. I guess the Greenberg thing is like, it's the attempt to make a sort of like static culture move by basically giving a dynamism to what is static. So it already poses a sort of like symptomatic character. It's not like it's just like a good thing, but it is also like, and Greenberg will kind of admit this, of being like, it's not like that. If you look at a Jackson Pollock painting, it's like faultless, but you actually have to uphold it against the alternative. There's even a moment like this in Adorno's response to Benjamin's work of art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction in a letter, like an earlier draft, where he says something like, you want to throw out like you want to basically uphold the trash film against the like good film, which I'm of course like 100% a supporter of, but you can't throw out like modernist art and like basically the high points of like culture in order to like uphold this. And it's like, you have to like actually take up both as like social symptoms. It's not just like we want to like uphold schlock against like what's apparently like high culture or something, because it's like a kind of like false dichotomy.
Yeah. And I think that's like something that a lot of people struggle with. I know I did, because it seems that like the sort of obvious thing to want to do as someone who's like educated and like cares about art and whatever is to uphold the avant-garde positively, to yearn for like some kind of art that's like intellectually adequate to your experience of reality, that for whatever reason kitsch art doesn't, or at least the way that it does so, it usually does so kind of in an unconscious way. Although there is like really good kitsch art that seems to be intellectually like self-conscious.
Is kitsch a thing that's endowed in the thing, or is it something that kind of like happens socially because people can just like look at it and just like understand what it is? Because it is like, people can like look at just like paintings that are like masterpieces now and they'll just like receive it as kitsch. Whereas they're just like, it seems like looking at a modern art painting from like the 1920s, like you might look at it and just have a kind of like predigested experience of it. You won't encounter it as something new. And you might actually be able to, if you get a kind of like education around it, where you might be like shocked by some aspects of it. Before it kind of just like seemed like, whoa, it's just part of the painting. But then you might like learn something about it, or even like forcing yourself to like really take notice of it and then have a sort of like vulgar experience of it, of being like, what am I looking at?
But yeah, I know there was like a platypus member in New York. She would always want to like watch these bad movies, or like insisted on ordering pizza from Domino's, and like,
what's wrong with Domino's? You anti-Domino's?
I am anti-Domino. Well, I would like rather have something better. I don't know. I mean, there's nothing wrong with Domino's, but when you're, I don't know. Like, but she had like a certain fetish for the fact that like the Domino's is like the people's pizza, or that like this movie or this music or whatever was kind of like the people's music, and that like we should kind of shun our own bourgeois tastes and things like that. I'm like, well, we can still like good movies and good food and good music, even if it's not kind of like what the guy down at the factory is listening to.
Yeah, you don't need to degrade your own tastes on the basis of like the people.
Yeah. Yeah, no, Papa John's was my bad pizza of choice.
What? Okay, no, now you're just being ridiculous. Papa John's